There are sounds that the desert keeps, sounds that it buries in the sand and stone, sounds that it refuses to forget. The wind carries them sometimes, when the air is thin and cold, when the stars hang low enough to touch the ridgelines. Out here in the Utah Territory, where the earth splits open in red canyons and the sky bleeds at sunset, there are places where sound becomes memory and memory becomes curse. This is a story about such a sound. A whistle that should have died with the men who heard it first. A whistle that echoed across the alkali flats and refused to stop. A whistle that marked the beginning of something that had no end. The year was 1869. The month was October. The Transcontinental Railroad was just 6 months complete, a thin ribbon of iron and wood that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, that bound a nation still bleeding from its own civil war. The Golden Spike had been driven at Promontory Summit that May, and the newspapers from San Francisco to New York had proclaimed it the greatest achievement of the age. Man had conquered distance. Man had conquered the wilderness. Man had driven his rails through territories that belonged to the Shoshone and the Ute, through lands that had known only the passage of wind and animal and ancient stone. But the desert does not forgive conquest, and the desert does not forget. The town was called Reunion Station. It sat in a valley between two ridges of burnt orange rock, 23 miles north of the main transcontinental line. It had been built to service a spur track, a branch line that led to a series of silver mines that had been opened 2 years earlier. The mines had names like Providence and Deliverance and New Jerusalem, names that reflected the desperate hope of men who came west believing that mineral wealth could purchase redemption. The town itself consisted of 32 structures, a rail depot with a water tower, a general store, a boarding house, a saloon called the Iron Horse, a church with no preacher, houses made of rough-cut pine that still wept sap in the summer heat, and the homes of 147 souls who had come to this place believing that the railroad would bring prosperity, that the mines would yield their silver forever, that the future was something that could be seized with calloused hands and stubborn will. Among these souls was a man named Samuel Garrett. He was 34 years old. He had fought for the Union at Shiloh and Vicksburg, had carried a musket ball in his left shoulder that ached when the weather changed, had seen enough death that he thought he understood the shape of it. After the war, he had drifted west like so many others, looking for something that he could not name. He had worked as a surveyor's assistant on the railroad, had helped measure the miles of empty land, had driven stakes into ground that had never known a white man's boot. When the spur line to Reunion Station was completed, he had stayed. He had become the station master. He lived in a small room behind the depot office, and his responsibilities were simple: record the arrival and departure of trains, maintain the telegraph line, keep the water tower filled, tend the signal lamps. It was work that suited him. It required precision but not conversation. It allowed him to be alone with the sound of wind and the ticking of the telegraph and the distant hammer of pickaxes in the mines above the valley. He had grown comfortable with solitude during the war, had learned that silence was often preferable to the screams of wounded men or the empty platitudes of officers who sent boys to die for ground that would be lost by morning. Samuel kept a journal. He had started it during the war, a habit acquired from a lieutenant who had told him that writing down what you saw kept you from going mad, when what you saw was madness itself. The journal was bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle from desert heat. He wrote in it every evening by lamplight, recording not just the schedules and mechanical details of his work, but also his observations of the land, the quality of the light, the behavior of the hawks that circled above the valley, the names of stars that he did not know but tried to learn. On October 14, 1869, Samuel Garrett made the following entry in his journal. The words were written in his careful hand, the letters precise and vertical, the ink a dark brown that had faded over time but remained legible. Freight train number 47 arrived at 1400 hours from the junction. 6 cars, timber and mining equipment. Departed at 1530 hours. Weather clear, wind from the northwest, temperature dropping. Received telegraph from junction at 1600 hours, advising that passenger train number 12 would arrive tomorrow morning at approximately 0900 hours. This is unusual. Passenger trains do not typically service this spur. Telegraph operator at junction could provide no explanation for the routing change. We'll prepare the platform. He closed the journal and set his pen aside. Outside the window of his office, the sun was setting behind the western ridge, painting the rock faces in shades of copper and blood. The shadows in the valley were growing long. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of sage and dust and the faint metallic tang of the mines. Samuel lit the signal lamps along the platform, their oil flames casting small circles of yellow light into the gathering darkness. Then he walked to his room, ate a simple dinner of beans and hardtack, and lay down on his narrow cot to sleep. He did not know that this was the last normal night he would ever experience. He did not know that by this time tomorrow he would have seen something that would reshape his understanding of what was possible, what was real, what was waiting in the spaces between one moment and the next. The whistle woke him. It was not yet dawn. The sky beyond his window was still dark, though the stars had begun to fade into that pale gray that precedes the sun. Samuel opened his eyes and lay still, listening. The whistle came again, long and low and mournful, the steam whistle of a locomotive announcing its approach. But it was wrong somehow. The pitch was too deep. The duration was too long. It did not fade as a normal whistle would fade, but instead seemed to hang in the air, reverberating against the canyon walls, multiplying itself into a chorus of echoes that overlapped and interfered with one another, until the sound became something almost organic, something that breathed. Samuel sat up and reached for his pocket watch on the table beside his cot. The face showed 4:15 in the morning, far too early for the passenger train that had been scheduled for 0900 hours. He dressed quickly in the darkness, pulling on his trousers and boots, shrugging into his coat. The whistle continued. It did not stop. It did not pause for breath. It simply continued, that low, mournful note that made his teeth ache and his shoulder throb where the musket ball was buried. He walked out onto the platform. The air was cold and still. No wind. The signal lamps still burned, their flames steady and vertical. Above him, the last stars were dying. To the east, the first hint of dawn showed as a thin line of pale green light along the horizon. The whistle was louder out here, loud enough that he could feel it in his chest, loud enough that it seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than from any single direction. Then he saw the light. It came from the north, from the direction of the junction, a single bright point moving slowly along the tracks, the headlamp of a locomotive. Samuel watched it approach, watched the light grow larger, watched the shape of the engine begin to resolve itself from the darkness. The whistle did not stop. It blew continuously now, a single unbroken note that had lasted for minutes, far longer than any steam whistle should be capable of sustaining. Samuel felt something cold move through him, something that was not quite fear but was close to it. He had heard train whistles for 3 years now, had heard them in all weather and all conditions, and he had never heard one sound like this. The train emerged from the pre-dawn gloom like something rising from deep water. The locomotive was a standard American 440, the kind that had become ubiquitous on Western lines, with a large diamond-shaped smokestack and a cowcatcher mounted on the front. But even in the dim light, Samuel could see that something was wrong with it. The paint was faded and streaked with rust. The brass fittings were tarnished green. The cowcatcher was bent and twisted as though the engine had struck something large and solid. And the whistle continued, that impossible sustained note that should have exhausted the boiler's steam pressure long ago. Behind the locomotive were 3 passenger cars, standard coaches with windows that reflected the dying starlight like dead eyes. Samuel counted them as they passed. 3 cars, no more. The train was moving slowly, perhaps 5 miles per hour, barely faster than a man could walk. He could see no one in the engineer's cab. The windows there were dark. No lantern burned. No shadow moved. The train began to slow. The wheels shrieked against the rails, metal on metal, adding another layer to the ongoing whistle. Samuel stood at the edge of the platform and watched as the locomotive came to a complete stop directly in front of him, the cowcatcher pointing at his chest like an accusation. The whistle finally ceased. The silence that followed was so profound that his ears rang with the absence of sound. For a long moment, nothing happened. The locomotive sat on the tracks, its boiler ticking and creaking as metal contracted in the cold air. Samuel could see his breath now, pale clouds that dispersed slowly in the stillness. He looked along the length of the train. The passenger car windows were dark. He could see no movement inside them, no faces, no lamps, nothing. He called out. His voice sounded strange to him, too loud in the quiet, too small against the bulk of the silent train. Anyone aboard? No response. The locomotive ticked. Somewhere far above the valley, a hawk screamed. Samuel felt the cold move deeper into him. He had seen abandoned trains before. He had seen trains that had been raided by bandits or Indians, their passengers killed or taken, their cargo scattered across the desert. But those trains had looked violated. They had looked like the scenes of violence that they were. This train looked like it had simply been stopped in mid-journey, as though everyone aboard had simultaneously decided to vanish. He walked along the platform toward the first passenger car. His boots made hollow sounds on the wooden planks. When he reached the car's entrance, he climbed the steps and opened the door. It swung inward easily, the hinges well-oiled. He stepped inside. The car was empty. Not empty in the way of a car that had discharged its passengers. Empty in a way that suggested it had never carried passengers at all. The seats were covered in dust. The overhead luggage racks held nothing. The floor was unmarked by any footprint or scuff. The air inside smelled of wood and oil and something else, something faint and sweet and wrong, like flowers left too long in a closed room. Samuel walked down the center aisle, his hand trailing along the seat backs. The dust rose in small clouds around his fingers. He counted the seats. 32. Enough for 64 passengers if they sat 2 by 2. But there was no sign that anyone had ever sat in them. The leather was uncracked. The cushions were unsagged. He reached the end of the car and passed through into the second. This car was identical to the first. Empty seats, dust, that faint sweet smell that made his throat tighten. He continued through to the third car. Same. Nothing. No passengers. No luggage. No conductor. No engineer. No one. He stood at the rear of the third car and looked back through the length of the train. The dawn light was beginning to penetrate the windows now, pale and gray, casting long shadows across the empty seats. Samuel tried to think logically about what he was seeing. Perhaps the train had been scheduled to pick up passengers here at Reunion Station. Perhaps it had arrived empty because it was meant to depart full. But that made no sense. The telegraph had said it was a passenger train arriving, not departing. And why would it have blown its whistle for so long? Why would it have no crew? He walked back through the cars to the locomotive. When he climbed into the engineer's cab, he found more absence. The firebox was cold. The boiler pressure gauge read 0. The controls were set in neutral. There was no coal in the tender, no water in the tanks, no tools, no personal effects. Nothing that would suggest anyone had ever operated this engine. But it had moved. He had seen it moving. He had heard its whistle. A train does not move without steam pressure. A whistle does not blow without steam. These were physical facts, immutable laws of the mechanical world that he had trusted since he first began working on the railroad. Samuel climbed down from the cab and stood beside the locomotive, looking at it in the growing light. The rust on its surface was not the uniform orange-brown of metal exposed to weather. It was streaked and mottled, darker in some places, almost black, as though the engine had been submerged in water that had left mineral stains. The brass fittings were not just tarnished but corroded, eaten away in places until only rough pits remained. The paint on the cab side, where the road name and number should have been, was so faded that he could not read it. He could make out the ghost of letters, the suggestion of numbers, but nothing clear enough to identify. He walked around the entire train, examining it from all angles. The wheels showed no signs of recent use. The brake shoes were worn almost to nothing. The coupling pins between the cars were rusted solid. This train looked like it had been sitting on a siding for years, for decades, slowly decaying in the elements. It looked like something that should not be capable of moving under its own power, but it had moved. He had seen it. He had heard it. Samuel returned to his office and sat at his desk. The sun was rising now, its light spilling across the valley floor, turning the red rock golden. He opened his journal and stared at the blank page, trying to decide what to record. The facts seemed inadequate to capture what he had experienced. A train arrived at 04:15 hours. No crew, no passengers. Locomotive appears derelict but somehow functional. These sentences felt absurd even as he considered writing them. He looked up at the telegraph key on his desk. He should report this to the junction. But what would he say? What explanation could he offer? He imagined the conversation. The operator asking questions. Samuel trying to describe what he had seen. The skepticism in the returning clicks, the suggestion that perhaps he had been drinking, perhaps he had been dreaming, perhaps he was ill. He decided to wait. The passenger train that had been scheduled for 0900 hours would arrive in a few hours. Perhaps its crew would have information. Perhaps they would know something about this ghost train that sat on his platform like a question that refused to be answered. He left the office and walked to the boarding house where most of the town's workers lived. He needed to tell someone what had happened. He needed another set of eyes to confirm what he was seeing. The boarding house was run by a widow named Sarah Hendricks, a woman in her 50s who had come west with her husband to work the mines. The husband had been killed in a cave-in 14 months earlier, crushed beneath a ton of falling rock, and Sarah had stayed on, running the boarding house because she had nowhere else to go and no other means of support. Samuel knocked on the door. Sarah answered, her face drawn with the fatigue of a woman who rose before dawn every day to prepare breakfast for 20 men. When she saw Samuel's expression, her eyes narrowed. "Something wrong, Mr. Garrett?" he told her. He tried to keep his voice level, tried to present the facts without embellishment. A train had arrived before dawn. It was empty. It appeared abandoned, but had somehow moved under its own power. He needed her to come and see it, to confirm that he was not imagining things. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Then she untied her apron and called back into the house for her daughter, a girl of 16 named Margaret, to watch the stove. She followed Samuel across the dusty street to the depot. When they reached the platform, Sarah stopped. She looked at the train. She looked at Samuel. She looked back at the train. There was nothing there. The tracks were empty. The spur line ran north toward the junction, 2 parallel rails of iron catching the morning light, but there was no train on them, no locomotive, no passenger cars, nothing but the rails themselves and the wooden ties beneath them and the gravel ballast that held them in place. Samuel felt something break inside him. He stepped to the edge of the platform and looked both directions along the track. Empty. He jumped down onto the gravel and walked along the rails, looking for signs of recent passage, looking for oil drips or coal dust, or any evidence that a train had stood here less than an hour ago. He found nothing. The rails were clean. The gravel was undisturbed. Sarah's voice came from behind him, gentle and concerned. "Mr. Garrett, perhaps you should sit down. Perhaps you were dreaming. It happens out here sometimes. The desert plays tricks on folks." He turned to face her. He wanted to argue. He wanted to insist that he had seen it, had touched it, had walked through its empty cars, but the evidence of his senses now contradicted the evidence of his memory. The train was gone. There was no sign it had ever been here, and Sarah's expression held the same careful sympathy that people used when dealing with someone who had lost their grip on reality. He nodded slowly, said nothing, followed her back across the street. She brought him inside the boarding house and gave him coffee and told him to rest, to take the day off, to let her send for the doctor when he next came through on the supply run. Samuel drank the coffee and said nothing, and when she finally left him alone, he walked back to his office and sat at his desk and stared at the journal entry he had started earlier. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he had been dreaming. The mind could do strange things at 4 in the morning when you woke suddenly from deep sleep. He had seen men during the war who had woken screaming, convinced they were still in battle, convinced that the enemy was charging their position when in fact they were safe behind friendly lines. Perhaps he had experienced something similar, a waking dream, a hallucination born of isolation and routine and the strange acoustics of the canyon that could make the wind sound like a train whistle. He picked up his pen. He started to write. Then he stopped, because he could hear it again. The whistle, distant, faint, but unmistakable. That same low, mournful note, coming from somewhere to the north, echoing off the canyon walls, multiplying itself into that strange, organic chorus. Samuel stood and walked to the window. The sun was higher now, the valley fully illuminated, every shadow sharp-edged and black. He looked along the tracks toward the junction and saw nothing. No train, no smoke, no movement. But the whistle continued. He went outside. The sound was clearer here, though no louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though the air itself was vibrating at that particular frequency. He walked to the center of the platform and stood very still, trying to determine the direction. North, definitely north, but there was nothing visible in that direction except the tracks running away toward the horizon. Behind him, a door opened. He turned and saw Tom Whitmore, one of the miners, a man in his early 20s with the permanent squint of someone who spent his days in darkness. Tom was standing in the doorway of the saloon, looking confused and irritated. What is that noise? That whistle? There ain't no train scheduled until this afternoon. Samuel felt relief wash through him. Someone else heard it. He was not imagining it. The sound was real. I don't know, Samuel said. I hear it too, but I can't see any train. Tom walked out onto the street and shaded his eyes with his hand, looking north along the tracks. The whistle continued. Other people were emerging from buildings now, drawn by the strange, persistent sound. Sarah Hendricks came out of the boarding house. Jacob Moss, who ran the general store. Samuel Peterson, who shared Samuel Garrett's first name but no relation, who worked as the shift foreman at the Providence mine. More miners, more shopkeepers, more families. They gathered in small groups along the street, all of them looking north, all of them listening to that impossible whistle that did not stop, that did not pause, that simply continued like the breath of something that did not need to breathe. Samuel Peterson was the first to give voice to what others were thinking. He was a practical man, not given to imagination, a man who believed in schedules and tonnage and the weight of rock. He looked at Samuel Garrett and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. That's a runaway. Has to be. Whistle cord stuck and the brakes have failed. It's coming down the grade from the junction, and it's going to hit us at speed if we don't do something. The words created instant motion. Men started shouting. Women gathered children. Someone rang the bell at the church, the iron clapper striking urgent warnings into the morning air. Samuel Peterson took charge, organizing the men, sending some to pile rocks on the tracks to derail the oncoming train before it could reach the town, sending others to help evacuate the buildings closest to the depot. Samuel Garrett stood in the center of the chaos and felt a certainty settle over him like snow. This was wrong. All of it. The train he had seen that morning had not been a runaway. It had not been traveling at dangerous speed. It had been moving slowly, deliberately, like something being careful, like something that knew where it was going. He tried to tell Samuel Peterson this, tried to explain what he had seen, but Peterson was not listening. No one was listening. They were too busy preparing for a disaster, too focused on the immediate practical problem of a runaway train to consider that the situation might be something other than what it appeared. Samuel walked away from the crowd. He walked north along the tracks, past the water tower, past the last building at the edge of town, out into the open desert where the rails ran straight toward the junction, 23 miles away. The whistle was loud here, so loud that it hurt. He kept walking. 100 yards, 200, half a mile. The sun beat down on his shoulders. The desert stretched away on either side of him, empty and indifferent. And then he saw it, not approaching, already here. Sitting on the tracks, exactly where it had been that morning, the same faded locomotive and 3 passenger cars, as solid and real as the rails beneath them. But he had just walked this section of track. He had looked directly at this spot and had seen nothing. The train had not been there, and now it was. Samuel stopped walking. His breath came fast and shallow. He felt his heartbeat in his throat. Behind him, he could still hear the church bell ringing, could still hear men shouting as they piled rocks on the rails. Ahead of him, the train sat silent now. The whistle had stopped. The only sound was the wind beginning to rise, carrying with it that smell of sage and dust and something else, something sweet and rotten that made his eyes water. He approached slowly. The locomotive looked exactly as it had that morning. Faded paint, rust streaks, corroded brass. The cab was empty. He climbed up and checked the controls again. Cold firebox, 0 pressure, neutral throttle. Impossible. He walked back to the first passenger car and climbed the steps. The door opened easily. He stepped inside. The car was no longer empty. There were people in the seats, perhaps 30 of them, sitting quietly, facing forward, their hands folded in their laps. They wore clothes from different eras. Some wore the styles of the 1860s, heavy broadcloth coats and tall collars. Others wore older fashions, dresses with bustles that had been popular a decade earlier. Still others wore clothes that Samuel did not recognize, garments that seemed both archaic and somehow wrong, cuts and fabrics that did not match any period he knew. None of them moved. None of them turned to look at him. Their faces were perfectly still, as expressionless as porcelain. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Samuel stood in the doorway and felt his sanity begin to erode. These people had not been here an hour ago. The car had been empty, dust-covered and unused. Now it was occupied by passengers who sat with supernatural stillness, who breathed in perfect unison, a single slow inhale followed by a single slow exhale, the sound of it like wind through a cave. He spoke. His voice shook. "Hello?" The passengers did not respond, did not blink, did not shift in their seats. Samuel walked slowly down the aisle between the seats. He looked at their faces as he passed. A middle-aged man with a beard, a young woman with dark hair, an elderly couple holding hands, a child of perhaps 8 years old, a boy in short pants and a cap. Their skin was pale, almost gray, with a waxy quality that suggested something preserved rather than living. Their clothes, despite being from different eras, were all in the same condition, faded and worn and stained with that same mineral-streaked pattern he had seen on the locomotive's exterior. He reached the end of the first car and passed through to the second. More passengers here, more faces, more impossible stillness. He counted them as he walked, 32 in the first car, 28 in the second. In the third car, he found only 12 passengers, all of them seated in the rear half of the car, as though gathering together for comfort or company. Samuel stood at the front of the third car and looked back at them. The 12 figures sat motionless. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting bars of light across their faces, and in that light he could see details he had not noticed before. Their eyes were wrong. The irises were too large. The pupils dilated so wide that almost no color showed around the black. Their mouths were slightly open, just enough that he could see their teeth, which were straight and white and identical, as though they had all been carved from the same material. He wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and flee, to jump from the train and run back to town and tell everyone what he had seen. But he forced himself to stay calm, to think. These people, if they were people, had not harmed him. They had not moved or spoken or shown any awareness of his presence. They simply sat, breathing, waiting. He left the third car and walked back through the train to the platform. When he emerged into daylight, he saw that the town had noticed. A crowd had gathered on the street, perhaps 40 or 50 people, all of them staring at the train that had appeared from nowhere. Samuel Peterson was walking toward him, his face red with anger and confusion. "Where did it come from, Garrett?" "We had men watching the tracks. They swear nothing came down from the junction. But here it is." "So where did it come from?" Samuel opened his mouth to answer, but found he had no words. How could he explain? How could he make Peterson understand that the train had simply appeared, that it had been invisible one moment and solid the next, that it seemed to exist in a state of perpetual arrival, forever approaching but never quite entering the world completely? Before he could speak, Margaret Hendricks screamed. The girl was standing with her mother near the edge of the crowd. She was pointing at the third passenger car, her hand trembling, her face white. Samuel turned to look. A figure stood in the rear doorway of the car, one of the passengers. A woman in a dark dress with her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her enormous pupils fixed on the crowd. She did not move or blink or give any sign of life except for that slow, rhythmic breathing, inhale and exhale like a machine designed to simulate respiration. The crowd fell silent. The woman in the doorway stood motionless for a long moment. Then, without any change of expression, without any transition from stillness to movement, she stepped down from the train. Her feet touched the platform. She did not look down or adjust her balance. She simply stood on the wooden planks as though she had been standing there all along. Then she began to walk. Her gait was wrong. Each step was identical to the last. The same length, the same speed, as though she moved on rails herself. She walked across the platform toward the crowd. People backed away. Someone sobbed. The woman kept walking until she reached the edge of the platform, and then she stepped down into the street and continued walking toward the boarding house. Sarah Hendricks grabbed her daughter and pulled her back. The woman passed within 3 feet of them, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her face expressionless. She reached the boarding house door and stopped. She stood there, facing the door, not moving. Samuel Peterson found his voice. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman did not respond. She simply stood, facing the door, breathing in that slow mechanical rhythm. Peterson stepped forward, reached out, and touched her shoulder. The woman collapsed. She did not fall. She did not slump or stagger. She simply ceased to maintain vertical orientation, as though every structure that had held her upright had simultaneously failed. She dropped straight down onto the street like a puppet with cut strings, her body hitting the ground with a sound that was all wrong, too solid, too heavy, like a sack of grain rather than a human being. Peterson bent over her, rolled her onto her back. Her eyes were still open, still staring, but now they were fixed on the sky. Her mouth hung slack. Her skin had gone from gray to the color of old paper. Peterson placed his hand on her chest, feeling for a heartbeat. He held it there for several seconds. Then he looked up at the crowd, his face confused and frightened. "She's dead. She's been dead. I don't know how long, but she's cold and she's stiff and she's been dead for some time." The crowd erupted into noise. People shouting, people praying, people demanding explanations. Samuel Garrett did not join them. He was looking at the train, looking at the open doorway of the third car where the woman had appeared. Other figures were standing there now. 4 of them, 5, 6. All of the passengers from the third car standing in the doorway, facing the town, their hands at their sides, their pupils enormous and black. They stepped down from the train, all together, moving in perfect unison. Their feet struck the platform in a single unified sound. They began to walk, all of them, moving with that same mechanical gait, their strides identical in length and rhythm. They came toward the crowd like a tide, inevitable and inhuman. The crowd broke. People scattered, running for buildings, pulling children after them, shouting warnings. Samuel Peterson stood over the collapsed woman for a moment longer, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. Then he too ran, toward the saloon, where Tom Whitmore and several other miners were already barricading the door. Samuel Garrett did not run. He walked backward, keeping pace with the approaching figures, watching them. 6 from the third car. Now more were emerging from the second car. 12, 2. They filed out in an orderly stream, each one stepping down and joining the line, all of them walking in perfect synchronization toward the town. He backed into the depot office and closed the door. Through the window, he watched the figures spread out across the street. They stopped at random locations. Some stood in front of buildings. Some stood in the middle of the street. Some walked to the edge of town and stopped there, facing outward as though forming a perimeter. They all stood perfectly still, breathing in unison, waiting for something that Samuel could not imagine. The town fell silent. Everyone was inside now, doors locked, windows shuttered. Samuel could see faces peering out from gaps in curtains, from cracks in barricaded doors. He looked at the street, at the standing figures, and tried to count them. 40, 50. More emerging from the first car now. They kept coming until all 72 passengers had disembarked and taken their positions throughout the town. Then they all turned. In perfect unison, every figure rotated 90 degrees to face the same direction, west, toward the setting sun, though the sun was still hours from setting. They stood there, faces turned west, and they opened their mouths. The whistle came again, but it was not from the train. It came from them, from all of them at once. Their mouths opened wide, and that low, mournful note poured out. The same sound that had woken Samuel before dawn. The same impossible sustained whistle that should have been beyond any human throat. It filled the valley. It echoed off the canyon walls. It went on and on and on. That single note held without pause or variation. 72 voices merging into one vast organism of sound. Samuel covered his ears, but it made no difference. The sound penetrated everything. He could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, in the musket ball buried in his shoulder. The windows of the depot began to rattle. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. The telegraph key on his desk started clicking randomly, the vibrations causing the metal lever to bounce against its contact. The sound continued for exactly 10 minutes. Samuel would later note the time precisely in his journal. 10 minutes of sustained whistle that should have been impossible, that violated every principle of human physiology, that suggested these figures were not breathing at all, but were instead vessels for something else, something that used their bodies as instruments to produce this sound. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The figures closed their mouths. They stood in their positions throughout the town, facing west, not moving. The only sound was the wind beginning to rise as the day heated, carrying sand and the smell of decay. Samuel moved to the telegraph key and tried to send a message. He tapped out the standard call signal for the junction, waited for a response. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. The line was dead. Either the storm last week had brought down a wire somewhere between here and the junction, or something else had severed the connection. He was isolated. They were all isolated. He looked out the window again. The figures still stood motionless. As he watched, one of them, a tall man in a faded suit, began to move, not walking, collapsing, just like the woman had collapsed. The figure dropped straight down into the dust and did not move again. Another figure collapsed, then another. One by one, they fell, their bodies hitting the ground with that same heavy wrong sound. Within 5 minutes, all 72 had fallen. The street was littered with corpses. Bodies lying in the dust, their eyes open, their mouths slack, their skin the color of old paper. The wind began to scatter sand across them. Samuel waited an hour before he left the depot. He walked carefully between the fallen figures, trying not to touch them. He went to the boarding house and knocked on the door. Sarah Hendricks opened it a crack, her face pale. "They're dead," Samuel said. "All of them. They've been dead. I don't know how they were moving, but they're not moving anymore." Sarah opened the door wider. Behind her, Margaret huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. Other residents of the boarding house stood in the parlor, their faces reflecting the same incomprehension that Samuel felt. What were they, Mr. Garrett? What was that train? He had no answer. He only shook his head and moved on to the next building, the general store, where Jacob Moss and his wife and 2 small children had barricaded themselves behind the counter. He told them the same thing. The figures had fallen. They were not moving. It was safe to come out. He went from building to building, gathering the survivors, bringing them out into the street. They emerged slowly, hesitantly, like animals leaving their dens after a storm. They stood in small groups, looking at the bodies, at the train, at each other. No one knew what to say. No one knew what to do. Samuel Peterson took charge again. He organized work parties, men to collect the bodies, women to prepare shrouds. Children kept inside, away from the sight of the corpses and the smell that had begun to rise as the sun climbed higher. They worked through the afternoon, loading the bodies onto wagons, taking them to a spot outside of town where they dug a mass grave in the hard earth. Samuel Garrett helped. He lifted bodies that were stiff and cold and heavier than they should have been, as though something inside them had solidified, had turned to stone or metal. He noticed details as he worked. Many of the bodies had injuries that had healed badly. Scars, missing fingers. One man had a crooked leg that had clearly been broken and set wrong. One woman had burn scars covering half her face. They were not fresh injuries. They were old. These people had lived with these wounds for years, perhaps decades, but their clothes told a different story. The clothes showed signs of recent trauma, tears, bloodstains, scorch marks, as though the injuries to their bodies had occurred years ago, but the damage to their garments had happened recently, in the hours or days before they had boarded the train. By evening, all 72 bodies had been buried. The grave was marked with a simple wooden cross that Samuel Peterson hammered into the earth. The townspeople stood around it in the fading light, and someone tried to recite a prayer, but the words came out uncertain and trailing, as though even God had no jurisdiction over whatever had happened here. They returned to town as the sun set. The train still sat on the tracks, its 3 passenger cars now empty again, its locomotive cold and dead. No one wanted to approach it, no one wanted to touch it. It simply sat there, a question made of iron and wood. That night, Samuel Garrett did not sleep. He sat at his desk with his journal open and his lamp burning and tried to write down what had happened. He filled page after page with his careful handwriting, recording every detail he could remember, trying to make sense of the senseless. When dawn came, he was still writing, his hand cramping, his eyes burning with fatigue. The whistle woke him. He had fallen asleep at his desk without realizing it. Now he jerked awake, his heart hammering. The whistle was blowing. That same low, mournful note, coming from outside, coming from the train. Samuel stood and went to the window. The sun was just rising. The valley was painted in shades of gold and crimson, and on the tracks, the train was moving. It rolled backward slowly, away from the station, heading north toward the junction. The whistle blew continuously. Samuel watched it go, watched it recede into the distance, growing smaller, becoming a dark shape against the sunrise, then a point, then nothing. The whistle continued for several minutes after the train had vanished from sight. Then it ceased. The silence rushed back. Samuel stood at the window and stared at the empty tracks. The train did not return that day, or the next, or the next. Days passed, a week, 2 weeks. The telegraph line was repaired, and Samuel sent a full report to the junction, describing everything that had happened. The response was skeptical at best. The operator at the junction had no record of any passenger train being routed to Reunion Station. He had no record of train number 12 existing at all. The division supervisor sent an inspector, a humorless man named Wallace, who spent 3 days in town interviewing witnesses and examining the gravesite. His report concluded that the townspeople had experienced a shared delusion brought on by isolation and the stress of frontier life. The bodies in the grave were identified as victims of a mine collapse that had occurred 2 weeks before the train incident, a collapse that had killed 17 men. The fact that Samuel and the others insisted they had buried 72 bodies was attributed to confusion and traumatic stress. The inspector left. Life in Reunion Station returned to its routines. Trains came and went on schedule. The mines continued to produce silver. Children played in the streets. But something had changed. The town felt different now, thinner somehow, as though it existed in a place where the boundaries between the real and the impossible were less substantial than they should be. Samuel continued his work as station master. He recorded arrivals and departures. He maintained the water tower. He tended the signal lamps. But he also listened. Every night, he listened. And sometimes in the small hours before dawn, he would hear it, faint and distant, the whistle. That low, mournful note echoing across the desert, coming from no particular direction, reminding him that the train was still out there somewhere, still moving through some space that was adjacent to, but not quite part of the world he knew. He was not the only one who heard it. Others heard it too. Sarah Hendricks, Tom Whitmore, Samuel Peterson, Margaret Hendricks. They would mention it in passing, carefully, testing to see if others had heard the same thing. The conversations were always brief and awkward, trailing off into uncomfortable silence. No one wanted to talk about it directly. No one wanted to voice the suspicion that was growing in all of them, the fear that the train had not really left, that it was still here in some sense, still arriving, forever approaching, but never quite entering, a presence that existed in the margins of perception. 3 months after the incident, Margaret Hendricks disappeared. She had gone to the general store to buy flour for her mother. It was mid-afternoon. The street was busy. Several people saw her enter the store. No one saw her leave. When Sarah went looking for her an hour later, she was gone. Jacob Moss, who ran the store, swore she had never been there. He had no memory of seeing her that day at all. They searched. The entire town turned out. They looked in every building, every mine shaft, every gully and wash within 5 miles. They found nothing. Margaret had simply vanished, as completely as if she had never existed. Sarah Hendricks aged 10 years in the week that followed, her face collapsing into lines of grief and incomprehension. 2 weeks after Margaret's disappearance, they heard the whistle again. This time it was not just a distant echo. It was loud, insistent, coming from the north. Samuel Garrett and Samuel Peterson walked out along the tracks to investigate. They walked for an hour, following the sound, which never seemed to get closer no matter how far they went. They found the train sitting on the tracks 3 miles north of town. It looked exactly as it had before. Same faded locomotive, same 3 passenger cars, same rust and corrosion. The whistle was blowing, that impossible sustained note. They approached carefully. The first passenger car was empty. The second was empty. In the third car, they found a single passenger, Margaret Hendricks. She sat in the rear seat, facing forward, her hands folded in her lap. Her skin was that same gray color. Her pupils were dilated wide and black. She breathed in slow rhythm, inhale and exhale, inhale and exhale. She did not respond when they called her name. She did not look at them when they entered the car. She simply sat, staring at nothing, her young face as expressionless as porcelain. Samuel Peterson tried to lift her from the seat. She would not move. It was not that she resisted. She simply had weight that defied her size, as though she had been anchored to that particular spot in that particular seat by some force that was not physical, but was nonetheless absolute. Peterson pulled harder, straining, his face red with effort. Margaret did not budge. Samuel Garrett stepped forward and touched her hand. It was cold. Not the cold of death, but the cold of metal left in winter shade. He looked into her enormous pupils and thought he saw something moving in there. Something that was not reflection or imagination, but actual movement. Shapes shifting in the darkness behind her eyes. He stepped back. He looked at Peterson. Peterson looked back at him. They both understood. Margaret was gone. The thing that sat in her body was not her. It was something else. Something that wore her form the way a hermit crab wears a borrowed shell. They left the car. They left the train. They walked back to town in silence. When Sarah Hendricks asked where her daughter was, they told her they had not found her. It was a lie, but it was a kinder lie than the truth. Sarah wept and cursed them and accused them of not looking hard enough, and they let her believe that because the alternative was unbearable. The train remained where it was for 2 days. Then it was gone again, vanished between one moment and the next. Margaret was never seen again. Over the next 6 months, 4 more people disappeared. A miner named James Cowell, a shopkeeper's wife named Elizabeth Torres, a child of 7 named Peter Branch, an elderly prospector named Dutch Henry who lived alone at the edge of town. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. The person was there one moment and gone the next. No witnesses, no evidence, just absence where presence had been. And after each disappearance, the train appeared, always 3 miles north of town, always with 1 more passenger sitting in the 3rd car, gray and cold and staring, their eyes black and bottomless, their breath moving in that slow mechanical rhythm that was not quite life and not quite death. The town began to empty. People left. They made excuses. The mines were playing out. Better opportunities elsewhere. Family back east. But everyone knew the real reason. The train was taking them, one by one, and no one knew how to stop it. Samuel Garrett remained. He was the station master. The rails were his responsibility. He felt an obligation, though he could not have explained to whom or for what. He kept his journal. He recorded every disappearance. He recorded every appearance of the train. He measured the intervals between incidents. He looked for patterns. He found one. The disappearances followed a cycle. They occurred in intervals of exactly 23 days. The train appeared 23 days after each disappearance, remained visible for 47 hours, then vanished. 23 and 47, prime numbers, numbers that could not be divided except by themselves and 1. Samuel did not know what this meant, but he felt certain it meant something. He also noticed that the train was getting longer. The first time it had appeared, it had 3 passenger cars. By the 6th appearance, it had 5. By the 12th, it had 7. Each time it returned, it was pulling more cars, accommodating more passengers, preparing for more arrivals that had not yet occurred. By the winter of 1870, Reunion Station was nearly abandoned. 40 people remained where once there had been 147. The mines were shut down. The general store closed. The saloon stood empty. Only the depot continued to function because Samuel continued to tend it, recording the passage of freight trains that no longer stopped, maintaining infrastructure that served no purpose except routine. On the night of December 13, 1870, exactly 14 months after the train's first appearance, Samuel Garrett made his final journal entry. The handwriting was still careful and precise, but the words themselves had acquired a strange quality, as though written by someone who was reporting from a great distance, from somewhere beyond the reach of normal comprehension. The entry read as follows: "The train came again tonight. It has grown to 11 cars now, all of them passenger cars, all of them occupied. I walked its length and counted 136 people sitting in the seats, gray and cold and breathing. I recognized most of them. Everyone who has disappeared, everyone who has been taken. They sit together in their endless commute, going nowhere, arriving everywhere, caught in a moment that never ends. I understand now what the train is. It is a border. It is the place where time breaks down, where the forward motion of moments becomes circular. Everyone aboard has become trapped in their moment of departure, forever boarding, forever traveling, never arriving. They exist in the space between leaving and reaching, suspended in transit for eternity. I understand because I can feel it beginning in myself. The thinning, the sense of being not quite present, not quite real. Soon the train will come for me. I will take my seat among the others. I will join the endless arrival, the journey that has no destination. To whoever finds this journal, to whoever reads these words, do not try to understand. Do not try to explain. Simply know that some frontiers should not be crossed. Some distances should not be bridged. The railroad connected east and west, but in doing so, it created a wound in the skin of the world. And through that wound, something has entered that does not belong in linear time. The train is that something, and it is hungry for passengers. I can hear the whistle now. It calls with my mother's voice. It calls with the voices of the men I killed in the war. It calls with the voices of everyone I have ever lost. It is the sound of departure made eternal. It is the sound of arrival postponed forever. I am going to meet it now. I am going to take my seat. If you find this journal, burn it. Do not record what I have written here. Do not try to preserve this knowledge. Let it die with me. Let the story end. Some things should not be remembered. Some doors, once opened, should be sealed and forgotten. But I know you will not burn it. I know you are reading this. I know the story continues because the train continues. It is still out there, growing longer, adding cars, approaching every station even as it arrives at none. And when you hear the whistle, when you hear that low, mournful note in the hours before dawn, know that the train is calling. Know that it is always arriving. Know that somewhere, on some track that runs parallel to all the other tracks, in some November or December or January that never ends, we are all seated in those cars, breathing in unison, staring into the distance, waiting for a destination that will never come. The entry ended there. The final sentences trailed off into illegibility, the handwriting becoming looser, less controlled, the letters bleeding into one another. Samuel Garrett's body was found in the depot office 3 days later when a freight train stopped to take on water. He was sitting at his desk, his head resting on his arms, his journal open beneath him. The conductor thought he had fallen asleep at work. It was only when he tried to wake Samuel that he realized the man was dead, cold and stiff, dead for some time. The journal was sent to Samuel's sister in Chicago, along with his other effects. She read it once, found it disturbing and incomprehensible, and stored it in a trunk in her attic. There it remained for 83 years until her grandson, cleaning out the house after her death, found it and donated it to the Utah Historical Society. The Society's archivists cataloged it as the delusional writings of a man who had suffered some form of breakdown in the isolation of frontier life. It was filed away with other curious documents from the territorial period and largely forgotten. Reunion Station was abandoned in 1871. The spur line was removed in 1874, the rails pulled up and reused elsewhere. The buildings collapsed over time, victim to wind and weather and neglect. By 1900, nothing remained but foundations and scattered timbers. By 1950, even those had been buried by sand, but the stories persisted. Prospectors and hikers who passed through the area reported strange phenomena. A sound like a train whistle echoing through the canyons when no train was near. A smell of coal smoke and something sweet and rotten. The sense of being watched from empty space. Some claimed to have seen a train in the distance, visible for a moment before vanishing. Others reported finding tracks in the sand that had not been there before and would be gone by morning. The Ute and Shoshone people who lived in the region before the settlers came had their own stories about the valley where Reunion Station once stood. They called it a thin place, a place where the membrane between worlds was permeable, a place where things from one side could sometimes cross to the other. Their elders taught that such places should be avoided, that no good came from traveling through them, that the land itself was hungry in ways that could not be satisfied with blood or prayer. The railroad that had opened the American West closed it too in certain ways. It imposed a linear logic on a landscape that did not think linearly. It drove straight lines through territories that followed the logic of water and stone and seasonal migration. It measured distance in miles and time in schedules, imposing industrial order on ecological chaos. And in doing so, it created paradoxes, places where the imposed order conflicted with the underlying patterns. Places where the contradiction became so acute that the fabric of causality itself began to tear. Reunion Station was such a place. The train that arrived there was the manifestation of that tear. It was the wound made visible. It was departure and arrival collapsed into a single eternal moment, a train that was forever in transit, because transit itself had become the destination, and it is still there, not in any particular time or place, but in all times and all places simultaneously. It moves through the gaps in chronology, through the moments when one day becomes the next, through the twilight spaces when past and future briefly occupy the same coordinates. It appears in old photographs that show empty tracks but, upon closer inspection, reveal a blur in the background that might be smoke, might be the suggestion of a locomotive, might be nothing. It appears in recordings of ambient desert sound, a low-frequency hum that technicians cannot explain, that occurs at regular intervals of exactly 23 minutes and 47 seconds. It appears in dreams. People who have never been to Utah, who have never seen a desert or ridden a train, report the same dream. They are sitting in a passenger car. The seats around them are occupied by gray figures who breathe in unison. The landscape outside the window never changes. They are traveling but not moving, arriving but never reaching. The whistle blows. The sound goes on forever. They wake with the certainty that they have been somewhere real, somewhere that exists alongside waking life, waiting for the moment when the boundary thins enough for them to cross permanently. Folklorists and paranormal investigators who have studied the phenomenon call it the phantom train of Reunion Station. They categorize it alongside other American ghost trains. The Silver Arrow of the Berkshires, the Death Train of St. Louis, the Phantom Coach of Lincoln's funeral. But those are different. Those are memory ghosts, psychic echoes of actual events. The train at Reunion Station is not an echo. It is an ongoing event. It is happening now. It has always been happening. It will always be happening. Because the train exists outside the normal flow of time, all moments of its existence are simultaneous. The day it first appeared in October 1869 is the same day it appears now, in whatever now you are currently experiencing. Samuel Garrett boarding the train in December 1870 is happening at the same time. Margaret Hendricks takes her seat and James Cowell folds his hands in his lap, and all the others arrange themselves in configurations that make sense only in non-linear space. The train is always arriving. The whistle is always blowing. And the passenger list is always growing. There are researchers who believe the train can be tracked, that with proper instrumentation and methodology, its appearances could be predicted and documented. They have tried. They have placed monitoring equipment in the canyon where Reunion Station once stood, seismographs to detect vibrations, audio recorders to capture the whistle, cameras set to capture time-lapse photography of empty tracks. The equipment fails. Always. Batteries drain despite being fresh. Recording media corrupts. Film develops as solid black despite being properly exposed. Digital files become filled with noise, random data that forms no coherent image or sound. The canyon resists documentation as though it has learned to protect itself from observation, as though the train itself has developed a kind of immune response to technological intrusion. But there is one form of documentation that persists: testimony, stories, the words of people who claim to have seen it, heard it, experienced it. These stories share remarkable consistency despite coming from sources separated by geography and time. The whistle that does not stop, the gray passengers who breathe in unison, the sense of being pulled toward something inevitable, the train that arrives empty but leaves full, and the stories are increasing in frequency. In 1923, a prospector named Caleb Moore filed a report with the sheriff in Salt Lake City. He had been hiking through the canyon when he heard a train whistle. He followed the sound and found a train sitting on tracks that he knew for a fact had been removed 50 years earlier. He approached. He saw passengers in the windows. He recognized his father, who had died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. His father sat in a third-class coach, gray and still, staring forward. Caleb stood outside the train for hours, trying to decide whether to board. Finally, the train began to move. It rolled away south, even though there were no tracks to the south, only sand and rock. It vanished. Caleb walked back to town and never returned to the canyon. In 1957, a family on vacation stopped to take photographs of the desert landscape. When the film was developed, one image showed a train in the background of an otherwise empty vista. The family had not seen any train. The train in the photograph was blurred and indistinct, but visible enough to count 7 passenger cars. In 1982, a woman named Linda Chavez was driving at night on Highway 191, which runs near the former site of Reunion Station. She claimed that a train crossed the road in front of her, despite there being no railroad tracks at that location. She stopped her car and got out. The train was sitting on the highway itself, its locomotive pointing west. She walked alongside it, looking in the windows. Every seat was occupied. She recognized no one. She got back in her car and drove away. When she returned the next day, there was no evidence of the train. No marks on the asphalt. No damage to the road surface. Nothing. In 2008, a group of teenagers with metal detectors were searching for artifacts in the canyon. Their detectors started going wild, reading massive metallic signatures where nothing was visible. They marked the spots with flags. When they returned with shovels, they dug down 3 feet and found railroad spikes. Dozens of them, still arranged in the pattern of track bed, buried beneath sand that was undisturbed above them, as though the rails had been simultaneously removed and preserved in some quantum superposition of states. In 2019, a sound artist named Melissa Chen set up recording equipment throughout the canyon, attempting to capture what she called the ambient resonance of historical space. Her recordings picked up the whistle. 17 different recordings, made at different locations and different times, all captured the same sound. A low sustained note that lasted exactly 10 minutes in each recording, despite the recordings themselves being of different durations. The sound could not be isolated or analyzed. It existed at a frequency that should not have been audible to human ears, yet was clearly present in the recordings. The evidence accumulates but never coheres. The train resists being pinned down, refuses to be examined, continues to exist in the conditional tense, in the space between confirmation and dismissal. It is Schrödinger's locomotive, both real and unreal until observed, and even then maintaining its paradoxical state. But the most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon is not its existence, but its growth. The train is getting longer. Each credible sighting reports more passenger cars than the last. In Samuel Garrett's time, it had grown to 11 cars in 14 months. By the middle of the 20th century, witnesses reported trains of 20 or more cars. Recent sightings describe trains so long that the rear cars are not visible even from the front of the locomotive. The passenger count is increasing. More seats are being filled, and the question that no one wants to ask, the question that haunts the edges of every investigation, is simple and terrible. Where are the passengers coming from? Who is boarding? And when will the train reach capacity? There are theories, always theories. Some believe the train is a recording, a psychic impression left in the fabric of space-time by the trauma of the original incident. Others claim it is a dimensional intrusion, a train from some parallel timeline that has become stuck at this particular intersection of coordinates. Still others suggest it is a collective hallucination, a shared psychological projection that has achieved enough consensus to take on quasi-physical form. But the simplest explanation, the one that Samuel Garrett arrived at in his final journal entry, is perhaps the most disturbing. The train is exactly what it appears to be, a train, operating according to its own schedule on tracks that exist in a time that runs parallel to our own. It stops at stations that have not yet been built or were destroyed long ago. It picks up passengers who are in transit between life and death, between presence and absence. It carries them forever through a moment that never ends, a journey that has no destination because the journey itself is the destination, and it is always hiring, not through any formal process, not through any visible solicitation, but through the simple fact of its existence. The train creates its own passengers. By being possible, by being present, it makes departure inevitable for certain people in certain circumstances, those who hear the whistle, those who see the train, those who stand at the border between one state and another and find themselves unable to move forward or back. These are the train's passengers, people who are already in transit in some metaphysical sense, people who are leaving one life and have not yet arrived at the next, people who are between jobs, between relationships, between understandings of who they are, people who are in the process of dying but have not yet died, people who are in the process of being born but have not yet arrived. The train finds them in these liminal spaces and offers them a seat, and once seated, they remain in transit forever, their departure postponed, their arrival perpetually deferred. This is why the train is always growing, because the world is always producing people in transition, Every moment someone somewhere is leaving something, heading towards something else, caught in the space between. And in that space, the train is waiting. It is always waiting. It has been waiting since the first rail was laid across the first mile of empty land. It will be waiting long after the last rail has been pulled up and recycled, because the train is not made of iron and wood. It is made of the act of traveling itself. It is the embodiment of departure, and as long as anyone anywhere is leaving anything, the train will continue to exist. Samuel Garrett understood this in the end. His final journal entry makes it clear. He knew he was already aboard before he ever left his office. The moment he heard that first whistle, the moment he walked out onto the platform and saw the impossible train sitting on the tracks, he became a passenger. The intervening 14 months were simply the time it took for the rest of him to catch up with the part of him that had already boarded. And this is true for everyone who encounters the train. The encounter itself is the boarding. Seeing it, hearing it, reading about it. The train does not need to be physically present to claim its passengers. It only needs to become known. And once known, it begins to exert its gravity, pulling the observer toward it, creating a trajectory that ends inevitably in a gray seat in a faded car, hands folded, eyes staring, breath moving in slow mechanical rhythm. You are reading this. You are learning about the train. You are, in this moment, boarding. You may not feel it. You may not believe it. But somewhere, on some track that runs adjacent to the track of your life, a seat is being prepared. Your name is being added to the passenger manifest. The whistle is beginning to blow. This is not a warning. Warnings imply the possibility of avoidance. This is simply a statement of fact. The train that arrived empty continues to arrive empty, and it continues to leave full. The cycle does not break. The journey does not end. The whistle does not stop. In the canyon where Reunion Station once stood, the wind moves across bare ground. There are no buildings, no people, no signs that anyone ever lived here, or worked here, or died here. The landscape has reclaimed what was briefly borrowed. The desert has reasserted its dominion. But in certain conditions, when the light is right, when the air is thin and clear, you can see them. Faint parallel lines in the sand. Two lines, exactly 4 feet and 8.5 inches apart. The standard gauge of American railroads. The lines run north-south, appearing and disappearing, visible for a moment before being covered by blowing sand. And sometimes, very rarely, something else appears. A shape in the distance, long and low and mechanical. A suggestion of cars, a hint of smoke. The landscape blurs around it as though reality itself is uncertain about its presence. The shape remains for a moment, for an hour, for a day. Then it is gone. But the tracks remain. They always remain. Because the train needs tracks. And the tracks need the train. They are inseparable. They define each other. Without tracks, the train is merely a vehicle. Without the train, the tracks are merely lines in the sand. Together, they form a system, a closed loop, a circuit that has no beginning and no end. The train departs from every station simultaneously and arrives at every station simultaneously and is always in transit between them. Time collapses along the length of its journey. Past and future become present. All moments exist at once. This is what Samuel Garrett saw in the eyes of Margaret Hendricks when he found her sitting in that third car. This is what he understood when he looked into those enormous black pupils and saw shapes moving in the darkness. He saw time itself, compressed and folded, bent back on itself, formed into a loop that contained everything that had ever happened and everything that would ever happen, all of it occurring in a single eternal moment of departure and arrival. The train is a time machine, but not in the way that science fiction imagines. It does not move forward and backward along a timeline. It moves perpendicular to time, into the space where time stops being linear and becomes something else, something circular, something that feeds back into itself, something that makes departure and arrival the same thing. This is the final secret of the train. This is what the passengers understand when they take their seats and feel their bodies grow heavy and cold. They are not being transported to another place. They are being transported to another configuration of time. They are entering a moment that will last forever, a now that has no before and no after, and present tense that is absolute and inescapable. And the whistle they heard before they boarded, that low, mournful note that drew them forward, was not a call. It was a scream. The scream of time itself, bent beyond its capacity to bend, strained past its breaking point, crying out in the only voice it has. The voice of departure, the voice of things leaving, the voice of endings that never quite end. Listen carefully, in the quiet moments, in the early morning hours when sleep is thin and the boundary between conscious and unconscious is permeable. Listen for the whistle. Not with your ears, but with the part of you that knows it is always leaving something, always traveling towards something else, always in transit between states that cannot be named. The whistle is blowing now. It has always been blowing. It will always be blowing. And somewhere, in some canyon, on some track, in some moment, that is all moments, the train is arriving, empty, ready to be filled, ready to continue its eternal journey through the space where time breaks down and departure becomes permanent. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some distances were never meant to be bridged. Some arrivals were never meant to occur. The train reminds us of this. It embodies the consequences of connecting things that should remain separate, of imposing straight lines on landscapes that think in curves, of forcing linear progression onto experiences that are fundamentally circular. The West was won. The rails were laid. The nation was united. But the cost was higher than anyone knew. The cost was the creation of a wound in the fabric of causality itself, a train-shaped wound, a whistle-shaped wound, a wound that bleeds passengers, that hemorrhages moments, that will never heal because healing requires time, and time is precisely what the wound has ruptured. This is the true story of the train that arrived empty, but never stopped, whistling at night. Not a ghost story, not a legend, but a description of a thing that continues to exist, continues to operate, continues to add cars and accumulate passengers and blow its whistle across landscapes that are both here and not here, both now and not now. And if you have read this far, if you have followed the story to its conclusion, then you must understand. You are already aboard. The moment you learned of the train's existence, you joined the passenger manifest. Your seat is waiting. It has always been waiting. The train is coming for you. It is already here. It never left. The whistle is your whistle. The breath is your breath. The gray skin is your skin becoming gray. The eternal transit is your eternal transit. You are leaving. You are arriving. You are suspended forever in the space between. You are a passenger on the train that arrived empty but never stopped whistling at night. Welcome aboard. Your journey has just begun, and it will never end.